70 to 90% of business owners who sell regret how they sold, not that they sold. And that's because they feel they left money on the table. So 97% of the companies that we've tried to sell, we've sold, and 84% we've sold above the 75 percentile of the valuation, which means we're under-promising and over-delivering. Because more often than not, the children don't want to take over the business. They don't want the level of stress. They don't want to work as hard as they saw their dad or mom or both work. 99% of the market is going to see the company late or not at all, right? Which means you have effectively shrunk the market dramatically, which leads to a lower outcome financially and ultimately those regrets we talked about.
Welcome back to the Hustle and Grind podcast, the show where we dig into why real entrepreneurs trade comfort for conviction. This isn't about vanity metrics or overnight success. It's about the stories behind building a reputation that actually matters. I'm your host, Andrew, keynote architect, platform builder, and fellow founder in the trenches. Today, I'm sitting down with Kevon Saber, a founding partner of Legacy Outcomes. Kevon is someone who knows the entrepreneurial journey from start to finish. He's a two-time founder who sold companies to a Fortune 100 and to private equity. He's also the visionary who relaunched Go Check Kids, growing its valuation by over 100 times and helping 200,000 healthcare providers detect vision impairment to children. And he co-founded Gen Play Games, a company that collaborated with top athletes and generated over $70 million in sales. But after seeing how the M&A system was built to favor buyers, Kevon shifted his focus. He launched Legacy Outcomes to protect and maximize what truly matters for business owners, their legacy. Kevon is here to talk about what it takes to build and eventually sell a company with conviction. Let's dive in. So, Kevon, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. I'm really going to enjoy having a conversation with you because I think you have what could be a blind spot with most small businesses. We've all heard of Amazon buying companies that they come around and, that they want to buy they want the technologies that they go for and buy it, but we don't think about mergers and acquisitions in, medium-sized companies or with entrepreneurs. We don't think it's our thing. So thank you so much for being on today. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Andrew, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Perfect. So, Kevon, we heard a little bit about your intro earlier, but I want to hear about one specific story, the story that we were talking about when we had a chat before the episode about your company and why you do what you do. So let's start there.
Absolutely, Andrew. So I've started a bunch of companies and have had some strikeouts, but also some successes.
Nice.
You would think that when you sell a company, it's definitely going to be one of the successes, but that's not always the case. In fact, depending on what study you look at, 70 to 90% of business owners who sell regret how they sold, not that they sold. And that's because they feel they left money on the table. They feel they could have been more prepared and they could have had a better outcome. When I was in my late 20s, I had built up with three other co-founders a software company. We had a public company come knock on our door. They were one of our distributors and say, hey, we'd like to buy the company. This was back in 2007. And at the time, they were offering us $15 million, which meant more then than it does now, given inflation. But, as someone in my late 20s, that was a big deal, right? However, between that first conversation and when we actually got paid, we were totally outmaneuvered. Mm-hmm. We thought that knowing how to build a company, in this case, build software, hire great engineers, product managers, etc., and then get that software to market, meant that we were therefore good at business. And if we're good at business, we're good at selling companies too, right? Mm-hmm. We don't need a whole lot of outside expertise. Boy, were we wrong. That public company bought companies regularly. They had all kinds of tactics that they used to create deal fatigue, to set us up with traps that we never saw coming. And they ended up buying the company for far less than they should have because of our naivete.
Yeah. And that led to what you're doing now with your company too. Talk a little bit about what you're doing and how you're helping people through that.
So in the process of selling that company, and then after selling another one many years down the road, I realized that there's a huge gap in the market for mid-sized business owners. These are business owners who have an enterprise value for their companies between 20 and 90 million of, again, enterprise value. What does that mean in terms of revenue? Well, it's going to depend on the market, right? You talked about technology earlier. If it's a software company, it could be 5 million in revenue. If it's a healthcare company, that might be 10 million. If it's a traditional company. And we sell a lot of dirty jobs companies. These are businesses where people are showering at the end of the day instead of the beginning of the day. Construction, agriculture, low-tech manufacturing, marine services, waste management, environmental remediation. Those are all examples of dirty jobs companies. It's probably going to be more like a $20+ million in revenue company. And so what we decided to do, our founding partners, after each of us had sold our own companies and had regrets over how we sold, is to create a better mousetrap. We wanted to deliver a level of representation, a level of advocacy for these business owners that was not available to us when we sold. And so we took the best practices from Goldman and Lazard and JP Morgan, which are phenomenal for $1 billion or $5 billion company, but totally inappropriate because they're way too expensive for us, for a business that's in that $20 to $90 million enterprise value range. And we also looked at hundreds of stories of business owners and the regrets they had, and reverse engineered those two different processes or sides of the spectrum into a playbook that we call the Solar's Power Path that is actually delivering on our original intention. So 97% of the companies that we've tried to sell, we've sold, and 84% we've sold above the 75 percentile of value of the valuation, which means we're under promising and over delivering.
That's really good. That's a good thing. So because I think when we think about selling companies, we think, oh, great, I'll just do 2 times gross and that's it. We don't often think about exactly how to value a company and the proper way to do it. Can you talk a little bit about how that, like EBITDA multipliers, and how a company is valued a little bit so that people get a better idea for understanding it's not just your income, there's some more to it? Kind of go into some depth on that if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a textbook answer and then there's the actual market answer, right? The textbook answer does have truths to it, but it's a limited perspective. And that is free cash flow, right? Divided by the weighted average cost of capital minus the growth rate. So of course, the larger the EBITDA, to your point, the more valuable the company. That's the numerator. In the denominator, weighted average cost of capital really is a way to capture the stability of the business and also the risks facing the business, right? So if you have more risks, you're going to have a higher weighted average cost of capital. That's the denominator, and therefore that'll pull your value down. But I mentioned it's WACC, weighted average cost of capital. That's a mouthful, minus the growth rate. So the larger your growth rate, the more your value, right? And conversely, if you have a negative growth rate, that's going to actually decrease the quotient because the numerator hasn't changed, but the denominator is, right? So that's the textbook answer. That's what you're going to see in a microeconomics textbook. However, there's many qualitative aspects that you don't need to worry about if you just want a quick sale and you don't care about sort of maximizing your professional legacy from the time you spent building the business. If you do want to get a peak outcome, then you're going to pay attention to the fit between your business and the buyer who will profit most from buying that business, the buyer who will find your business indispensable to fulfill their strategy and their vision, right? So for example, we have a team that combs the earnings calls of public companies. They comb the annual reports. They are reviewing the private equity communications to the limited partners that have invested in those firms to understand where is there a unicorn fit or a perfect fit between the strategic, operational, and financial building blocks that we uncover while we're creating a valuation and the businesses that, again, will find that business most valuable because in their hands, it's worth the very most, right? And so it's really a different process if you're just solving for a sale versus if you're solving for a peak outcome.
Exactly. And, so company valuation, there's more to it than what people think. I think I've heard it once referred to as half art, half science, half a little bit of magic. It's not something where it's very straightforward.
Definitely art and science. Yeah. There's a common assumption, right? Which is that, well, I can just do a quick valuation based on my EBITDA. Yeah, you can, right? If you want to sell to a bottom feeder, right? Because that's what they'll pay. But if instead you want a phenomenal outcome, you need to take a different approach. The quick valuations, they gloss over those strategic, financial, and operational building blocks that drive the true value or the deep value. And without that forensic analysis, not only are you going to be unsure if you have alignment with whoever's representing you, because it's a finger in the air as far as what the business is worth. You're ultimately doing a superficial review that cascades into a flimsy marketing plan because those building blocks of value haven't been identified. The buyers who look at whatever materials are created are not seeing the depth and the substance that they want, and that erodes their trust. That results in retrading. That results in compromised negotiation. And so, yeah, it's a pretty flimsy place to begin.
So what I'd like to do, because I think a lot of times we learn best from the things that we've screwed up. I've done a lot. I think all of us as entrepreneurs have those moments where we're like, yeah, that wasn't good, but I learned something from it. And so as far as from your experience, the negative experience you had from selling your software company, what are some of the specific things that you had regrets over and in 2020 hindsight could share with people without, maybe going to a wee bit of a rabbit hole on it, but what were some of the things that you ran into?
Yeah. So we already talked about the quick valuation, so we won't retread that area. The second is letting the buyer dictate the process. They're dictating the timeline. They're dictating the valuation. They're dictating, because they have put you on the defensive by approaching you before you've actually gotten others involved. You want to have 10 sellers, 20 sellers, 10 buyers or 20 buyers who are bidding on your business, because that's where you get leverage, right? We just sold a company. We had 36 offers that conformed to the priorities that we created at the outset of the process. And we said, okay, of those 36, there's about 23 that have phenomenal reputations, are not likely to retrade you, which also happened to us, right? When we sold the software company. They have a phenomenal probability of closing based on all the empirics that we have and the conversations that we have as we're evaluating them. They have the financial wherewithal. So then we're retrading all of them up. You can see how, in this case, that seller had all the leverage. As opposed to what happened to us, we were on the back foot, just interacting with one buyer on their timeline, so they had all the leverage, right? Because we had a weak LOI, a letter of intent signed with that buyer, they also began to systematically erode our leverage. So, for example, they, in the middle of the negotiation process, actually hired some of our top employees. Well, our company was worth less after those employees were hired because of the know-how, because of their reputations, right, in the industry. And that's an example of a risk that can be mitigated, right, if you know what you're doing. I didn't know that in my mid-20s. And I think I'll mention one more that is just really powerful. This happened last week to a business owner. He told the story on X. This didn't happen to me specifically, but it happens all the time. We call it unintended consequences. So when a broker or an M&A firm is taking a shotgun approach to the marketing and just contacting every Tom, Dick, and Harry around, then the confidentiality of that seller is breached. And because everybody knows that this business is for sale. So what happened on X is this business owner, just totally livid, right? Said the photos our broker took were geotagged. And several people who reviewed the materials realized exactly which company was for sale. The word got out. Now my general manager is nervous. Several of the employees are thinking about quitting, right? And you can imagine how that can cascade into competition, poaching your customers, competition, like what happened to me, trying to poach your employees. You can imagine vendors, because they know they have leverage, starting to tighten the screws, right, on you as their customer. And so those unintended consequences are totally avoidable if instead you take a rifle approach by contacting the buyers who are going to pay the most instead of every potential buyer under the sun.
Yeah. And I think that, so there's a distinction I want to make here before we get into another little thing, and that is that we're talking mostly about brokers. That's what we think about when we go to sell a company. We go to a broker themselves, but there's another alternative. And I think that's more what your company does. Talk to me a little bit more about an M&A team. Like, why would I want a team versus just a broker who kind of knows what they're doing and might be able to pull people in, as needed, like an assessor to assess the actual stuff. What are the benefits to actually having that team around you?
Yeah, if you have a solo practitioner, as well-intended as they are, they're going to be juggling valuation, forecasting, buyer outreach, negotiation, diligence, and many more items, usually with blind spots and cookie-cutter documents. If you were to get into a football game, let's just talk about the NFL or a college football game, and you showed up with one running back, how well is that single player going to do against a team? Right? The buyer is fielding a full team across the deal. And so if you want to actually maintain your leverage and control, you're going to have an elite M&A firm that also utilizes specialists that are sharpening every play and driving the peak outcome you deserve across all the different components. There's too many components for anyone to be an expert in all of them. So for example, we have on our teams, we have one person, it's a controller level financial executive who's doing the bulletproof valuation. That's looking at the business through 7 different valuation techniques and then blending them in a weighted average fashion to make a recommendation on the range that the business is likely to sell for. They're identifying those building blocks, right? Then you have a positioning specialist who creates all the marketing materials. Now, materials, plural, is actually really important to underscore because a broker, they only have so much time. They're going to create one set of materials that are typically a deck and a forecast. That's not what we do. We identify the different types of buyers that are likely to buy this business, and then we create a different set of marketing docs and a different set of financials for every single buyer type. We're selling a medical technology company right now. There's 3 types of buyers that are likely to buy this company: private equity firms, search funds, and strategic buyers, right? The private equity firms don't have a large sales team to maximize distribution quickly of this industry-leading product. The strategic buyers do. So our forecasts assume salespeople who can quickly bring it to market for the strategic buyers, whereas the private equity firms, we're assuming they're going to hire a sales team. Now, that customization is so important because then there's a lot less translation that the analysts in these potential buyers have to do to make the case, the recommendations to their higher-ups to either buy the company or not, right? And when something looks like it's totally irrelevant for you, you're less likely to spend time on it because you have so many opportunities that are coming your way as a buyer. And so brokers, there are great brokers out there. Let me be very clear. And for a business that's doing 1 million, 2 million, 3 million in revenue, the best brokers will do a good job for those companies. But things get a lot more complex when you're dealing with a 30 million or 70 million revenue company, number of employees, the different types of contracts that they have, the different kinds of liability that they have, the different kinds of insurance they have, real estate, and so on and so forth. And so that's where you really want to bring running backs, a quarterback, wide receivers, an offensive and defensive line, special teams to the party so that you have a chance of not just winning the game, but winning the Super Bowl at the end of the season.
Exactly. So I know we touched on this a little bit. So you have what you call the seller's power path. And what is that and how does it work?
Yeah, so the power path is the opposite of the seller's path to regrets. That's the path that most sellers take, right? The power path is the road less traveled. It's we call it the narrow path that leads to peak value and legacy preservation. I mentioned where we got it earlier, but it's methodical, it's specialized, and it's really built to enable the owner to seize and maintain control during every one of the stages. So what are the stages? The first stage is prepare, right? That's where we're determining the objectives that the seller has. We have 15 different objectives. We lay them out on the table and we say which ones are high, which ones are medium, and which ones are low priority. Because the whole playbook, every stage, every part of the strategy and the plan are customized to fulfill whatever those top objectives are, right? We already talked about the forensic analysis and the valuation and positioning angles that helps us to identify this specific buyer. So I won't go over that again. The next stage after that prepare stage, which has the bulletproof valuation as one of the key pillars, what we call create. Buyers are going to build their own story if you don't give them one. And so this is about sharpening, shaping those right narratives, those customized growth cases and forecasts that are tailored to each buyer type. This is really how you control perceptions out of the gate. It's not just about presenting the business, right? You're crafting what that business is going to be in the hands of that buyer while setting the terms for the future stages. You're setting those expectations. Now, after we create all those materials, we go into stage 3, which is attract, right? We're actually contacting those buyers. We're positioning the business as a unique asset, not a commodity. We're showing them how that business is going to unlock specific value for those buyers that is fulfilling whatever mandate they've communicated to their shareholders. This is where that positioning specialist is further tailoring the narrative. We're using scarcity and we're structuring the whole conversation. Unlike my first situation where the buyers were dictating the timeline, so that these buyers are now pursuing us, right? Stage 4 is called evaluate, right? We're looking at all the different layers of all the different offers. We're not just looking at the headline price, right? The deal structures are going to determine what is your probability of getting each of those dollars, right? So we're looking at deal structure, buyer motivation, financial capacity, the closing history or reputations of those firms. There's lots of structures that will inappropriately delay your payout as a seller. There's lots of structures that will inappropriately put liability back on your shoulders. You don't want to be worrying about that, right? After you sell. And so we're not chasing offers. We're pursuing elite outcomes, which positions us ultimately to have that leverage that enables us to trade all the best offers up, right? We call this a sharpening process. At the same time, we're pushing the weak ones aside. We're continuing to drive the pace, holding the line, and keeping the buyers competing on your terms, right, as a seller. So all of the plays, all of the scripting, all of the strategizing up to this point has really set us up for this second to last stage where momentum is accelerating with multiple bidders at the table. And then the last stage, of course, is legacy, right? Everything leads here. This is a well-run process that protects the employees, their career ladders, ultimately whatever the seller wants to do with their capital, whether that's invested into charities, invested in the stock market, invested in real estate, or create a generational plan, right? That is usually more than financial for the next 5 generations of their family. Awesome. That's the seller's power path. 6 stages, starting with what are your top objectives in selling?
Absolutely. Awesome, man. And I think, let's go in this direction here, because what I'm trying to do is a lot of people haven't thought about this, and I'm trying to kind of give them some reality around it about exactly how to go through this process. So let's talk about this one next. What does this look like to a standard business owner who's never thought about this before? So let's say that, because this is going to be a big thing right now, you've got a whole bunch of people who are in a certain age bracket who are trying to sell companies. There's 2 things they're going to do. They're probably either going to let the company fold, or they're going to take that company and send it off to a child or something and let it go from there. They may not have ever thought about that number 3. So we're talking about companies like about the 30 million range. So probably there's going to be some sort of a succession plan involved with that. What does that look like? What does that look like to the standard owner? To one that may not have thought about may not have thought about this before.
Yeah. So let's assume we're talking about an owner who has a business that has a strong enough foundation to either hand off to a successor or to sell. And there are many business owners who have a successor. It might be a longtime GM that has worked their way up through the company. It might be a daughter or a son or a nephew or a niece. It might even be a grandchild. Mm-hmm. What we find in 2025, and we've certainly seen this for the last few years, is more often than not, the children don't want to take over the business. They don't want the level of stress. They don't want to work as hard as they saw their dad or mom or both work, right? And a lot of times, those parents were working so hard, they did not take the time to foster the character, the diligence, the rest of the work ethic, right, in their children. And they have regrets about that, but they're not going to have a second set of regrets associated with letting the next generation squander what they've spent so many years building. Yeah. And so the first step really is to talk to an elite M&A firm. And it's important to say something really important here. We talked about brokers versus M&A firms. Mm-hmm. There's a second distinction that needs to be made. That's between most M&A firms, 97%, and elite M&A firms. 97% are not elite for a few reasons, but there's one we haven't talked about yet, and that is they have conflicts of interest. Mm. They represent buyers in a variety of ways. Mm-hmm. And if they are getting paid by a buyer who they're going to sell more companies to in the future, mm-hmm. and they're in theory representing you for one transaction over your whole life, where is their loyalty? It's to the repeat buyer. Mm-hmm. Most broker, again, it's close to 100% of brokers and 97% of M&A firms. They represent buyers. They also, in many cases, are on retainers by buyers to give those buyers first dibs or first access to every one of the transactions they bring to market. Yeah. Well, if five firms have first access to your company as a seller, that means 99% of the market is going to see the company late or not at all. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Which means you have effectively shrunk the market dramatically, which leads to a lower outcome financially and ultimately those regrets we talked about. Right. Yeah. And so there are a variety of ways that M&A firms and investment banks ultimately prioritize buyers over sellers. We don't have time for all of them today. But investment banks who have an asset management business are not usually going to tell you what you need to hear. They're going to tell you what you want to hear because they're trying to protect the relationship so that they can manage those $50 million or $80 million after the sale is done. True. A lot of investment banks, they push financing to the buyers, which creates another kind of conflict, right? So I just wanted to point that out real quickly, Andrew, because it's so important that sellers don't end up with a broker or an M&A firm that is not going to have exclusive loyalty to them, right? Yeah.
Well, it's like the insurance companies. The insurance company lawyer isn't your lawyer. It's the insurance company's lawyer, and it's really meant to protect them, not you.
That's a perfect example. Yeah, exactly. But let me come back to the core of your question.
Sure.
So what does the process look like? So once you decide I do want to sell, right, the key is to start having conversations, ideally a year before you want to sell, so that with an expert eye, you can identify the skeletons that need to be taken out of the closet and actually done away with, right? So that the buyer doesn't look at those and say, gosh, this sounds really risky, right? This is really a deal with a lot of hair on it. And therefore I want to discount the value by 30%. It's better just to address those, right? If some of them are not addressable, so then you want to disclose those, because if a buyer hears it from you and your representation, then they see you as a fair dealer. Mm-hmm. If they discover it on their own, then they think that they can't trust you, right? Another thing that you want to do about a year out is start having conversations with the M&A firm that you might be working with on tactical changes you can make to the business, right, over that time period without it being rushed, right? There might be some operational tweaks. There might be some documentation that you need to do so that your processes are better understood to the buyers. Sometimes there's an opportunity to actually bolster the management team so the buyer doesn't see the business as dependent on you. Mm-hmm. And if the employees have been there for a little bit longer, then there's less risk, right? Yeah. Then you ultimately come to the point of doing a valuation, and you can do a quick valuation with all the superficial elements we talked about earlier and all of the negative pitfalls of a superficial valuation, or you'll do a formal forensic analysis. We talked to a lot of M&A firms who say, gosh, we didn't really know what company we were selling until 2 months into the engagement. Well, that doesn't serve them, and it certainly doesn't serve you, right, as a seller. And so get a valuation, ideally from an M&A firm or from a valuation expert that knows firms. You want to ideally understand through the valuation process, do I like their processes? Do I like their character? Do we actually seem compatible in how we see this business and how we see the world and how we see engaging with buyers? Sometimes that by evaluation process, we find out as an M&A firm that they have one set of books for the government and they want a buyer to look at totally different books. Well, if a buyer can't trust them and the government can't trust them, we're not going to take them on as a client, right? And it's better to figure that out before you start the engagement during the valuation process than after you start the engagement, because now you're restarting the clock in a much bigger way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are some of the preliminary steps long before you sign an engagement letter with an M&A firm. Excuse me. I've said a lot of words today. I'm approaching my word limit.
So basically the process is essentially like trying to sell a car where, you address the scratch in the back and we'll take care of it for a second. That's okay. Right up front, you do it before letting them find out, and you vacuum out the car first before you sell it, just to make it look decent. You're not covering anything up. You're just making it look good.
There are many ways that the metaphor of selling a car or a house don't apply to selling a company, but that exact example is spot on.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That's the first thing that I thought of is when you were talking about some of the we're gonna make things look good, set things up for success so that they know it's all set. So,
yeah. Kevon, part of the reason I brought that up is a lot of the brokers, they are ex-car salesmen or
that's not good,
or ex-realtors, right? And that just kind of sets their minds down a path of thinking that a business sale is very simple. And it can be simple if you don't want peak value, right? But preparation, buyer strategy, timing, those are key inputs that ultimately enable a totally different level of outcome. It's better to think about it as a enterprise software sale, right? Multiple stakeholders, multiple phases. It is to think about it as a simple transaction or even an impulsive transaction. It's the difference between, like you said, buying something on the internet and choreographing every stage to avoid the costly regrets that come from shortcuts.
Exactly. Kevon, thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate it. This is something that I didn't, I learned a little bit about it in business school, but didn't hear about it as an entrepreneur until a couple of years ago, and actually seeing how it works with businesses. And I think it's really important. So thank you so much for bringing some wisdom with us today. I appreciate it.
Andrew, it's been a blast. Thanks for having me.
Anytime. Thanks for tuning in to the Hustle and Grind podcast, where we unpack what it really takes to build something that matters. If today's conversation hit home, do me a favor. Share it with someone who's in the trenches too. And if you're building your own brand, platform, or message and want help turning that story into serious authority, head over to theauthorityforge.com to see how we can help. Until next time, keep showing up, keep shipping, and keep chasing the work that sets you on fire. I'm Andrew, and this was the Hustle and Grind podcast.